The northern Alaska wind carried a warning that morning, a bitter cold that penetrated even the most insulated gear and reminded anyone foolish enough to venture into it that nature held dominion here. Dr. Frank Garrison had learned to read these warnings over his 15 years studying Arctic geology, but March in the Brooks Range was unpredictable at best, and today's clear skies had given him false confidence. At 43 years old, Frank had built his reputation on meticulous field research, documenting the rapidly changing ice formations along Alaska's northern coast, where climate shifts were transforming the landscape in real time. His temporary research station, positioned on a rocky outcrop overlooking a massive glacier system, had been his home for the past 6 weeks. The isolation didn't bother him anymore. In fact, he'd grown to appreciate the stark beauty of this frozen wilderness, the way the light played across the ice fields at dawn, painting them in shades of pink and gold that seemed impossible in such a harsh environment. On March 12th, Frank prepared for what should have been a routine 3-day expedition to survey a newly formed ice cave system he'd spotted during an aerial reconnaissance flight 2 weeks earlier. The cave was located approximately 15 miles northeast of his base camp, accessible by snowmobile for most of the journey, and then on foot for the final approach. He'd made dozens of similar trips during his career, each one carefully planned and executed with the kind of methodical precision that had kept him alive in some of the world's most unforgiving environments. His survival pack was a model of efficiency, 72 hours of emergency rations consisting of high-calorie energy bars and freeze-dried meals, a satellite phone with backup battery, comprehensive medical supplies including splints and pain medication, climbing gear rated for Arctic conditions, a portable stove with enough fuel for a week of cooking, water purification tablets, emergency flares, a space blanket, and his personal research equipment including cameras, sample containers, and GPS units. He wore layers of specialized cold-weather gear, the outer shell designed to resist wind speeds up to 70 miles per hour, while the inner layers wickered away moisture to prevent the deadly combination of sweat and cold. The temperature that morning registered negative 28 degrees Fahrenheit on his weather station, cold but manageable with proper preparation. Frank had worked in temperatures that would have killed an unprepared person within minutes, had learned through hard experience how to move in extreme cold, how to conserve energy, how to recognize the early signs of hypothermia and frostbite. He loaded his gear onto the snowmobile, double-checking every item against his written checklist, a habit that had saved his life more than once when fatigue or cold made it easy to forget crucial supplies. The machine roared to life, its engine sound seeming obscenely loud in the vast silence of the tundra. Frank pulled down his goggles, adjusted his face mask, and set off across the frozen landscape, following GPS coordinates he'd programmed the night before. The journey started smoothly, the snowmobile tracks from previous expeditions still visible despite recent snowfall, providing a reliable path across terrain that could hide deadly crevasses beneath innocent-looking snow bridges. 3 hours into the trek, the weather betrayed him. What meteorologists called a sudden Arctic front swept down from the north with terrifying speed, transforming clear skies into a blinding whiteout within minutes. One moment Frank could see the distinctive peak that marked his destination. The next, he was engulfed in a swirling chaos of wind and snow that reduced visibility to less than 10 feet. He'd experienced Arctic storms before, knew their terrible power, knew that the only sensible response was to stop, set up his emergency shelter, and wait it out. But according to his GPS, he was less than a mile from the ice cave entrance, and the cave would provide far better shelter than any tent could offer in these conditions. It was a calculated risk, the kind of decision that seemed reasonable at the time, but would haunt him later. Frank reduced his speed to a crawl, navigating by GPS alone, trusting the technology to guide him through the storm. The wind howled around him, tearing at his clothing, finding every gap and seam with icy fingers. Snow accumulated on his goggles faster than he could wipe it away, forcing him to rely increasingly on brief glimpses of the GPS screen. When the ice cave entrance finally materialized through the swirling snow, it appeared suddenly enough to startle him. The opening was larger than he'd expected, a gaping mouth in the glacier's face that promised sanctuary from the murderous wind. Frank didn't hesitate, didn't pause to properly assess the entrance or consider whether entering an unstudied ice cave during a storm might compound his risks rather than reduce them. He parked the snowmobile just inside the entrance where it would be protected from the worst of the weather, grabbed his pack, and ventured deeper into the cave. His headlamp illuminated walls of ancient compressed ice that glowed with that characteristic blue color, the result of centuries of pressure forcing out air bubbles and creating ice so dense it absorbed all colors of light except blue. The cave was beautiful in an alien way, its walls sculpted by flowing meltwater into smooth curves and sharp angles that seemed almost deliberately artistic. The temperature inside was actually slightly warmer than outside, the ice providing insulation from the wind that was the real killer in Arctic conditions. Frank moved carefully, testing each step before committing his full weight, photographing the formations as he went. This was why he did this work, these moments of discovery when he could document geological features that might not exist next season, when warming temperatures would reshape or destroy formations that had persisted for decades or centuries. The cave twisted downward into the glacier's heart, and Frank followed it, drawn by scientific curiosity and the desire to fully document this system before the storm made him lose valuable research time. He should have turned back after the first 100 feet. He should have recognized that the cave's downward slope was steeper than safe, that the ice beneath his crampons was too smooth, too perfect, too much like glass. But hindsight is always clearer than the decisions we make in the moment, and Frank pressed forward, eager to reach what appeared to be a larger chamber ahead, where the walls opened up into what his headlamp suggested might be a cathedral-sized space. The crack came without warning, a sound like a gunshot that echoed through the confined space and sent Frank's heart rate soaring with instant adrenaline. He had perhaps half a second to register what was happening before the ice beneath his feet gave way completely and he was falling through darkness, his headlamp beam spinning crazily as his body tumbled through empty air. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, the fall feeling both eternal and instantaneous. His mind had time to think, "This is how I die," followed by the impact that drove all thought from his consciousness in an explosion of pain so intense it whited out everything else. When awareness returned, Frank found himself lying on his back on solid ice, staring up at a circle of dim light, perhaps 15 feet above him, the opening through which he'd fallen now impossibly out of reach. If you're captivated by this incredible survival story and want to see how Frank makes it through this ordeal, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, and share this amazing tale of human endurance with your friends and family. Your support helps us bring you more unbelievable true stories. Now, let's continue with Frank's desperate fight for survival. The pain in Frank's left leg was unlike anything he'd experienced before, a white-hot agony that made him gasp and then immediately regret gasping as the cold air seared his lungs. He lay motionless for several minutes, letting his body's initial panic response subside, forcing himself to assess the situation with the clinical detachment his training had taught him. Moving his head sent waves of dizziness through him, suggesting a possible concussion, but his vision remained clear, and he could move all his extremities, which meant his spine was intact. That was the good news. The bad news became apparent when he tried to sit up and his left leg screamed in protest. Looking down, Frank could see, even through his insulated pants, that the ankle was wrong, bent at an angle that nature had never intended. The joint was already swelling. He could feel the pressure building inside his boot, and he knew from his wilderness medicine training that he had perhaps 30 minutes before the swelling would make it impossible to remove the boot. If that happened, if circulation was cut off, frostbite would claim his toes within hours. With shaking hands, Frank unlaced his boot and carefully, agonizingly slowly, worked it off his injured foot. The pain nearly made him black out, grey spots dancing at the edges of his vision, but he pushed through it, knowing that keeping the boot on was a death sentence. His thick wool sock was already discolored with blood, and when he gently probed the ankle, he could feel the wrongness of the bones beneath the rapidly swelling flesh. Definitely broken, possibly a compound fracture, though he couldn't see bone through the skin, which was a small mercy. Frank fumbled in his pack for his medical supplies, hands clumsy with cold and shock. He forced himself to swallow 2 pain pills with a sip of water from his bottle, knowing they'd take at least 20 minutes to kick in, but needing something, anything, to take the edge off the agony that threatened to overwhelm his ability to think clearly. Next came the splint. Frank had practiced this procedure in training, had even splinted broken limbs on injured colleagues in the field. But doing it to yourself with hands already going numb from cold and shock proved infinitely harder than doing it to someone else. He used the aluminum poles from his emergency tent, designed to be lightweight but rigid, positioning them on either side of his ankle and lower leg. Wrapping them required him to sit up fully, which sent fresh waves of pain radiating from the injury, but Frank bit down on a leather glove and forced himself to finish the job. He used elastic medical wrap and then duct tape, that universal solution to field problems, to secure the splint. The result wasn't pretty, but it was functional, immobilizing the joint and providing at least some protection against further damage. He fashioned a crude sock from a spare t-shirt, wrapping his foot in the fabric to provide minimal insulation, since getting his boot back on was impossible with the splint. Only after addressing his immediate medical crisis did Frank allow himself to fully assess his situation, and what he saw made his stomach clench with fear that had nothing to do with physical pain. The chamber he'd fallen into was roughly 20 feet across and perhaps 30 feet long, with walls of solid blue ice rising to the ceiling 15 feet above his head. The hole through which he'd fallen was the only visible exit, and even if his leg had been sound, Frank doubted he could have climbed out without rope and equipment, both of which had scattered across the chamber floor during his fall. He could see his climbing rope coiled against the far wall, tantalizingly close but impossibly far, given his inability to walk. The satellite phone, his lifeline to the outside world, had landed about 10 feet away, and Frank's heart sank as he dragged himself toward it, the ice floor scraping against his body even through his heavy clothes. When he finally reached the phone and powered it on, the cracked screen flickered once and went dark. No signal, no power, no help coming from that direction. Frank spent the next hour taking inventory of what he had versus what he needed, the calculus of survival reduced to brutal mathematics. His food supply, calculated for 3 days of active exploration and travel, would last perhaps 7 days if he rationed strictly and accounted for his reduced activity level. The fuel for his portable stove represented maybe 5 days of cooking and snowmelting if he used it sparingly. His water purification tablets were sufficient for 2 weeks, but that assumed he could melt snow, which required fuel. He had 3 spare batteries for his headlamp, enough for perhaps 20 hours of light if he used it only when absolutely necessary. His emergency flares were useless inside an ice cave, and his emergency blanket, while it would help retain body heat, was designed for temporary shelter, not long-term survival in sub-zero temperatures. The math was inescapable. Even under the best circumstances, with strict rationing and perfect conservation, Frank had perhaps 10 days before he ran out of the most critical supplies. After that, he would slowly freeze to death in this beautiful blue prison. The first night was an education in suffering. Despite the emergency blanket wrapped around him and his best efforts to create a sheltered position against the chamber wall, the cold was relentless and insidious. It crept through his layers of clothing, found every gap and opening, worked its way into his core, despite his body's desperate efforts to maintain its temperature. Frank knew the stages of hypothermia from his medical training. First came the shivering, violent shaking as the body tried to generate heat through muscle activity. Then came the confusion and drowsiness as core temperature dropped, followed by the paradoxical undressing where victims would remove their clothing while freezing, their brains too confused to recognize the danger. Finally came unconsciousness and death, usually within hours once the later stages began. He was determined not to let it reach that point, but fighting the cold required constant vigilance. He did exercises with his upper body, flexing and relaxing muscles to maintain circulation. He wrapped his injured leg as best he could, trying to protect the extremity that was most vulnerable to frostbite now that it was exposed without a boot. By the second day, despair threatened to overwhelm practical survival measures. The pain in Frank's ankle had subsided to a constant throbbing ache, managed but not eliminated by his carefully rationed pain medication. His food had become an obsession. Each energy bar divided into smaller and smaller portions that barely satisfied the gnawing hunger that constant cold created. The human body burns enormous calories just trying to stay warm in Arctic conditions, and Frank could feel himself beginning to weaken despite his best efforts at nutrition management. He called out regularly, hoping against hope that another researcher might be in the area, that someone might hear his shouts and come to investigate. But the ice swallowed his voice, and the only response was the occasional crack and groan of the glacier itself, settling and shifting under its own immense weight. Those sounds became his companions, along with the steady drip of meltwater somewhere in the darkness beyond his headlamp's range. The dripping at least assured him of water access, something to extend his survival beyond the limits of his fuel supply. The third day brought no change in his circumstances, but a significant change in Frank's mental state. The initial panic and fear had burned away, replaced by a cold determination to survive that matched the temperature around him. He established a routine, waking exercises to get blood flowing, careful rationing of his breakfast, an hour of rest to conserve energy, more exercises, a small lunch, documentation of his situation in a notebook he'd found in his pack, thinking that if he died here at least someone would eventually find his body and know what had happened. He wrote messages to Catherine, his wife of 18 years, telling her things he'd never quite managed to say during their marriage, expressing love and regret in equal measures. He wrote about his research, about the beauty of the ice formations surrounding him, about the strange peace that came from knowing you might die, but choosing to fight anyway. Writing helped, gave structure to time that otherwise threatened to become a meaningless blur of cold and pain and hunger. On the fourth day, Frank made the discovery that would save his life. He'd been exploring the limits of his prison, dragging himself along the ice floor in systematic grid pattern, mapping every feature of the chamber out of sheer desperation for something to do, some way to occupy his mind beyond the constant calculation of remaining supplies and dwindling time. In the far corner of the chamber, partially hidden by a formation of ice that had melted and refrozen into a bizarre sculptural shape, Frank found the seal. At first he thought it might be a hallucination, a product of early hypothermia or simple desperation, but when he touched it, the body was solid and real. The animal had been dead for months, possibly longer, its body preserved perfectly in the glacier's embrace. It was a young ringed seal, common in these waters, probably swept into the cave system during the previous season's storms, or perhaps during a period when the glacier's melt had created temporary water channels that later froze solid, trapping the creature in ice. The seal carcass was frozen solid, its flesh long past any possible consumption, but the thick layer of blubber beneath its skin remained intact, preserved by the constant cold. Frank stared at it for a long moment, his mind racing through everything he knew about Arctic survival, about the indigenous peoples who had thrived in these conditions for thousands of years before Europeans arrived with their modern technology and sophisticated gear. The Inupiaq people had used seal blubber for fuel, had burned it in stone lamps called kulik, that provided both heat and light through the long Arctic winter when temperatures made survival seem impossible. Frank had seen kulik lamps in museums, had read academic papers about their construction and use, had even attended a demonstration at a cultural center in Barrow, where an elder had shown how the traditional lamps worked. Could he replicate that technology here, with only his knife and the materials at hand? The idea seemed desperate, almost laughable, but Frank was beyond pride and well past the point where conventional solutions might save him. Using his multi-tool knife, he began the painstaking work of harvesting the seal's blubber. The fat was frozen harder than stone, requiring him to chip away at it in tiny fragments, warming each piece in his hands before he could cut it free. The work took hours, exhausted him completely, left him shaking with fatigue and cold. But when he was done, Frank had collected perhaps 5 pounds of seal blubber, enough to potentially extend his heat source by weeks if he could figure out how to make it burn. The first challenge was creating a container that could hold melted fat without itself melting or burning. Frank's portable stove used pressurized fuel that burned at very high temperatures, but seal blubber burned much cooler, more like a candle than a conventional fire. He used his empty fuel canister, carefully cleaning it and fashioning a crude wick holder from bits of wire and metal stripped from his pack's frame. The wick itself presented another problem. Traditional kulik lamps used Arctic cotton grass or dried moss, materials that Frank didn't have access to in his ice cave prison. He experimented with different options, testing strips of fabric from his spare clothes, cotton from his medical supplies, even fibers teased out of the synthetic materials in his pack. Each attempt failed in different ways. Some materials refused to absorb the melted blubber and wouldn't stay lit. Others burned too quickly or produced toxic smoke that made his eyes water and his throat constrict. Frank approached the problem methodically, documenting each failure in his notebook, adjusting his technique based on what didn't work. On his 7th attempt, using cotton strips from his spare t-shirt twisted tightly and soaked in partially melted blubber, he achieved combustion. The flame was small, barely larger than a birthday candle, and it produced a greasy smoke that smelled terrible, but it burned steadily, converting stored seal fat into heat and light through a chemical process that hadn't changed in millions of years. Frank sat watching that tiny flame, with tears streaming down his face, the moisture freezing on his cheeks even as he smiled. It wasn't much, barely enough heat to warm his hands when he held them close to the flickering light, but it represented possibility, represented hope, represented a chance at survival that had seemed impossible just hours before. He let the first lamp burn for an hour, studying how the blubber melted and fed the flame, how the wick needed to be adjusted to prevent smoking, how the whole system worked in practice rather than theory. Then reluctantly, he extinguished it, needing to conserve his precious fuel supply until he'd perfected the technique. Over the next 2 days, Frank refined his blubber lamp design, creating multiple wicks that could be lit simultaneously for more heat, positioning his emergency blanket to reflect the warmth back toward his body, even fashioning a crude hood to capture and direct the heat more efficiently. The smoke remained a problem. But he discovered that if he positioned the lamp carefully, natural air currents in the cave would carry most of the smoke away toward the hole above, providing enough ventilation to make the system sustainable. By day 7, Frank had established a new routine centered around his revolutionary heat source. He burned the seal blubber lamp continuously now, maintaining a small flame that kept the worst of the hypothermia at bay. His portable stove fuel, so critical during the first days, could now be reserved exclusively for melting snow to drink, extending his survival timeline by weeks. His food situation remained desperate, the energy bars dwindling to a few remaining portions that he eyed with the kind of longing usually reserved for gourmet meals. But at least he wouldn't freeze. The blubber lamp became the center of his world, a tiny sun around which everything else revolved. He tended it constantly, adjusting the wick, adding small amounts of fat when the flame grew low, protecting it from drafts that might extinguish the flame and force him to use precious matches to relight it. Frank talked to the lamp, gave it a name, treated it like a living companion in his isolation. The psychological benefits of having the flame, of having light and warmth in the darkness, proved almost as important as the physical warmth it provided. The days began to blur together into a numbing routine of survival. Frank woke each morning, if morning had any meaning in the unchanging twilight of the ice cave, and performed his exercises to maintain circulation in his body. His injured ankle remained immobile. The swelling had gone down, but the break showed no signs of healing without proper medical attention. He could feel himself growing weaker despite his best efforts, his body consuming its own muscle tissue to fuel the constant demands of staying warm in sub-zero temperatures. His face had grown gaunt, his hands seemed skeletal when he looked at them in the lamplight, and he knew that even with the seal blubber extending his timeline, there were limits to how long a human body could survive in these conditions without adequate food. He'd lost track of exactly how many days had passed, the count somewhere between 10 and 15, time becoming meaningless when each day was identical to the last. His notebook entries grew shorter, less detailed, his handwriting becoming shaky as cold and weakness made fine motor control difficult. Then, on what Frank later learned was day 15 of his imprisonment, he heard the helicopters. The sound was faint at first, barely audible over the constant background noise of the glaciers creaking and groaning, but it grew steadily louder until there was no mistaking it. The distinctive thump of rotor blades, the mechanical whine of turbine engines, the sounds of human technology and potential rescue. Frank screamed until his throat was raw, pounded on the ice walls with a metal pan from his survival kit, created as much noise as he possibly could. He lit one of his emergency flares, not caring that it was designed for outdoor use, watching as the red chemical flame filled his chamber with brilliant light and acrid smoke. The helicopters passed directly overhead, so close that Frank could hear the change in engine pitch as they maneuvered, could see their searchlight beams playing across the ice, visible through the hole above him. They had to see the smoke, had to hear his desperate cries, had to notice the obvious signs of distress. But the helicopters passed on, their sound gradually fading back into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt more profound than anything Frank had experienced before. The hope that had sustained him shattered in that moment, replaced by a despair so overwhelming he could barely breathe. He'd been so close, searchers had been right there, and they'd missed him. The next few days were the darkest of Frank's ordeal, not physically, but psychologically. The knowledge that people were looking for him, but had failed to find him, was almost worse than believing no one was searching at all. He spiraled into depression, stopped doing his regular exercises, barely maintained his seal blubber lamp, ate nothing from his meager remaining supplies. What was the point of extending his suffering if rescue was impossible? The ice cave would be his tomb, his body wouldn't be found until the glacier melted decades or centuries from now. Catherine would never know what happened to him. These thoughts circled in his mind like vultures, feeding on his weakness and despair. For perhaps 24 hours, Frank gave up, simply lying in his sleeping bag, with his eyes closed, waiting for the end to come. But something in him, some stubborn core of determination that had sustained him through graduate school and difficult fieldwork and the everyday challenges of life, refused to completely surrender. On what he thought might be day 17, Frank forced himself to sit up, relit his lamp from the few coals still smouldering in the blubber, and began to plan. If the helicopters had come once, they would come again. Search patterns in the Arctic were systematic, overlapping, designed to cover every possible area where a missing person might be. Frank needed to make himself more visible, needed to create signals that couldn't be missed even by searchers moving quickly overhead. He gathered every reflective surface from his equipment, his emergency blanket, pieces of aluminum foil from food packaging, the shattered screen of his satellite phone, even strips of reflective tape peeled from his pack. Working slowly, conserving his limited energy, Frank dragged himself and his materials to the area directly beneath the hole through which he'd fallen. He arranged the reflective materials in the largest pattern possible, weighing them down with ice fragments so they wouldn't blow away. When sunlight hit them, they should create flashes of light visible from the air. Next, he prepared smoke signals, gathering materials that would burn with maximum smoke production. His portable stove fuel would create black smoke. The seal blubber produced greasy white smoke, and various items from his pack would create different colors and densities of smoke. Frank organized everything within easy reach, so that if he heard helicopters approaching, he could quickly create multiple smoke signals simultaneously. The preparations took 2 full days and left Frank completely exhausted, but they also gave him renewed purpose. He resumed his exercise routine, forced himself to eat the last of his energy bars despite having no appetite, tended his seal blubber lamp with the care it deserved. On day 20, by his best calculation, the weather finally cleared. Frank could see the difference through the opening above. The grey chaos of storm clouds replaced by patches of blue sky, the relative stillness indicating reduced wind. Clear weather meant helicopters could fly, meant search operations would resume with renewed intensity. Frank burned extra blubber that day, creating a continuous column of smoke that rose toward the opening. He had no way to know if the smoke made it to the surface, if it was visible to aircraft, but he had to try. The smoke was his voice, his signal to the outside world that he was still alive, still fighting, still hoping for rescue. The helicopters returned on day 21, and this time Frank was ready. The moment he heard the distant sound of engines, he lit every smoke-producing material he had prepared, creating a thick mixture of black and white smoke that filled his chamber and rose in a dense column toward the surface. He banged on his metal pan, screamed his throat raw, waved his reflective emergency blanket in the beam of his headlamp, anything and everything to draw attention. The helicopter sound grew louder, directly overhead now, and then it changed. The pitch shifted, the rhythm altered, and Frank knew with sudden, absolute certainty that they'd seen him. The searchers had finally found him. He collapsed against the ice wall, sobbing with relief so intense it felt like pain, barely able to believe that his nightmare was ending. Minutes later, a voice called down from above, strong and professional, and the most beautiful sound Frank had ever heard. "Can you hear me down there? This is Alaska Air National Guard Pararescue. We're coming to get you. Hold tight, you're going to be okay." The extraction operation was a masterclass in technical rescue, though Frank was barely conscious enough to appreciate it at the time. 2 para-rescue specialists, Master Sergeant Tom Bradley and Technical Sergeant Rebecca Stone, rappelled down into his chamber with equipment and confidence that seemed impossible given the confined space and challenging conditions. They assessed his condition rapidly, starting an IV to combat the severe dehydration that Frank's body was suffering, administering pain medication that actually worked unlike his exhausted supply of over-the-counter pills, wrapping him in specialized thermal blankets designed to gradually and safely raise his core temperature. Tom documented Frank's makeshift seal blubber lamp with obvious amazement, taking photographs and asking questions even while preparing Frank for transport. The lamp was still burning, its small flame steady and reliable, providing light for the rescue operation. Rebecca stabilized Frank's broken ankle with a proper splint, replacing his crude aluminum poles with medical-grade equipment, her hands gentle but efficient as she worked. Getting Frank out of the chamber required rigging a complex pulley system, as his broken ankle made it impossible for him to assist in his own rescue by climbing. Tom and Rebecca secured him in a specialized rescue litter, essentially a rigid stretcher with multiple attachment points, then coordinated with the team above to slowly raise the litter through the narrow opening he'd fallen through 3 weeks earlier. Every movement sent spikes of pain through Frank's injured leg despite the medication, but he endured it, knowing that this discomfort was temporary and meant salvation. Once through the opening, they had to navigate the twisted ice cave passage to reach the surface, a journey that took nearly an hour of careful maneuvering. When Frank finally emerged from the cave into daylight, the brightness was so intense after weeks in the blue twilight of the ice that he couldn't open his eyes for several minutes. The helicopter waited as close to the cave as the pilot could safely manage, its rotors creating a downdraft that blew snow in swirling patterns across the glacier surface. The flight to Fairbanks Memorial Hospital took 90 minutes, and Frank drifted in and out of consciousness for most of it, awareness fragmenting into brief moments of sensation and sound. The helicopter's vibration, the warm air from the heater that felt almost painfully hot after weeks of cold, voices speaking above him in calm professional tones discussing his condition and treatment. At some point, someone placed an oxygen mask over his face, the pure air filling his lungs and clearing his head enough to understand that he was really, truly safe. When they loaded him into the ambulance at Fairbanks, Frank managed to catch Rebecca's eye and mouth the words, "Thank you," utterly inadequate for the miracle she and her team had performed, but all he could manage. She squeezed his shoulder gently, smiled and said, "That's what we do. You did the hard part, staying alive for us to find you." The hospital was a blur of activity. Doctors and nurses surrounding him, machines beeping and monitoring, hands touching him gently but constantly as they assessed the damage. Frank's core temperature was measured at 94 degrees Fahrenheit, significantly below normal, but high enough to avoid the most dangerous complications of severe hypothermia. His ankle required immediate surgery. The bones had begun healing incorrectly during his imprisonment and needed to be rebroken and properly set. The frostbite damage to his fingers and toes was moderate, enough to cause permanent nerve damage and require months of therapy, but not severe enough to necessitate amputation, an outcome that Dr. William Chen, the trauma specialist examining him, called remarkably lucky given the circumstances. And Frank had lost 26 pounds from his normally lean frame, his body had consumed its own muscle tissue to fuel survival, and his blood work showed severe nutritional deficiencies and the beginnings of kidney dysfunction from prolonged dehydration. But he was alive, conscious and responsive, which Dr. Chen said was honestly more than they'd expected when the call came in about a researcher found after nearly a month in an ice cave. Catherine arrived 6 hours after Frank reached the hospital, having caught the first available flight from Anchorage the moment she received the call that her husband had been found alive. Frank was in surgery when she arrived, but she waited in the family area, clutching a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, staring at the wall and trying to process the emotional whiplash of the past 3 weeks. When they'd first reported Frank missing, she'd held on to hope, believing that his experience and training would keep him alive until searchers found him. But as days turned into a week and then 2 weeks, that hope had slowly transformed into grief as she'd prepared herself for the inevitable discovery of his body. The call this morning informing her that Frank was not only found but alive had shattered that grief, replacing it with joy so intense it felt like terror. Now, waiting for him to emerge from surgery, Catherine felt like she was holding her breath, afraid that if she let herself truly believe he would be okay, something would go wrong. When she finally saw him, Frank was barely recognizable. His face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over prominent cheekbones, his eyes sunken deep in their sockets. Purple-black frostbite marks covered his nose and cheeks, and his hands, visible above the blankets, were wrapped in bandages protecting damaged tissue. But his eyes were alert when they found hers, and the smile that spread across his face, painful and weak but genuine, was completely Frank. Catherine sat beside his hospital bed and took his bandaged hand as gently as possible, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Frank's voice was rough, damaged from weeks of screaming in an ice cave and breathing cold air, but the words were clear enough. "I love you. I'm sorry I put you through this. I'm sorry." Catherine shook her head, squeezing his hand. "You survived. That's all that matters. You stayed alive and you made it home. Everything else, we'll figure out together." The media discovered Frank's story within hours, and by the next morning it had become national news. The tale of the geologist who'd survived 28 days in an Arctic ice cave using a seal blubber lamp fashioned from materials he'd found and techniques borrowed from indigenous survival practices captured public imagination in a way that surprised everyone involved. Frank's hospital room became a circus of interview requests, documentary proposals and book deals, all of which he declined from his hospital bed with increasing irritation. He didn't feel like a hero or a survival expert. He felt like an idiot who'd made a series of small bad decisions that had compounded into a potentially fatal situation, and who'd gotten incredibly lucky that a dead seal happened to be in his prison and that he'd remembered enough from a cultural demonstration to fashion a crude lamp. When he finally agreed to one interview with a local reporter, Frank spent most of it deflecting attention from himself and focusing on the skill and courage of the pararescue team, the traditional indigenous knowledge that had saved his life, and the importance of respecting the Arctic environment's power. Dr. Patricia Alvarez, a cultural anthropologist from the University of Alaska who specialized in indigenous Arctic survival techniques, visited Frank during his second week in the hospital. She'd seen news coverage of his seal blubber lamp and wanted to document it for academic purposes, with Frank's permission. Their conversation lasted 3 hours, Frank describing in detail how he'd constructed the lamp, what materials he'd used, the challenges he'd faced making it work. Dr. Alvarez listened with obvious fascination, occasionally asking clarifying questions, making notes and sketching diagrams. When Frank finished, she sat back in her chair and shook her head in amazement. "What you created was essentially a qualic, the traditional Inupiaq oil lamp that sustained Arctic peoples for thousands of years. The fact that you were able to recreate it under those conditions, with no proper materials, and while suffering from hypothermia and a broken ankle, is genuinely remarkable. You've demonstrated something anthropologists have argued about for decades, that these survival techniques are intuitive enough to be reconstructed by someone with only basic knowledge of their principles." The Alaska Native Heritage Center in Anchorage reached out shortly after Dr. Alvarez's visit, requesting permission to feature Frank's story and his improvised seal blubber lamp, which the pararescue team had carefully preserved and brought out with them, in a permanent exhibit about Arctic survival. Frank agreed immediately. seeing it as an opportunity to honor the cultural knowledge that had saved his life and to educate people about the sophisticated survival technologies developed by indigenous peoples. He consulted extensively with Inupiaq elders during his recovery, learning the proper construction and use of kulik lamps, understanding the cultural context and spiritual significance of fire and light in traditional Arctic life. These conversations humbled Frank, revealing depths of environmental knowledge and practical wisdom that went far beyond anything he'd learned in his academic training. The elders treated him with kindness and respect, sharing their knowledge generously while also gently correcting some of his assumptions about Arctic survival. 6 months after his rescue, Frank stood again at the edge of the glacier that had nearly killed him. His left ankle was functional but weak, requiring a brace for extended walking and likely to give him problems for the rest of his life. The frostbite damage to his fingers had healed as much as it would, leaving permanent numbness and reduced dexterity that made some of his research work more challenging. But he was alive, mobile, and had returned to the field despite Catherine's concerns and his own occasional nightmares about being trapped in ice. This trip was different, though. Not research, but memorial. With him were Catherine, Captain Jennifer Reeves, and several members of the para-rescue team that had saved him, Dr. Alvarez, and 2 Inupiaq elders, who'd agreed to participate in a ceremony honoring the seal whose preserved body had provided the blubber that kept Frank alive. They placed a memorial marker near the ice cave entrance, the plaque made of bronze that would weather the Arctic conditions for decades. The inscription read, "In gratitude for nature's provisions and the ancient wisdom of those who learned to survive in harmony with the Arctic, March-April 2025. The Inupiaq elders performed a traditional blessing, acknowledging the seal's spirit and thanking it for its unintended gift, their words in Inupiaq flowing like music across the frozen landscape. Frank felt tears freeze on his cheeks as he listened, overwhelmed by the profound connection between life and death, between human ingenuity and natural providence, between desperation and hope. The ice cave that had imprisoned him was already changing, the glacier's constant movement reshaping the formations, and Frank knew that within a few years it might collapse entirely or transform into something unrecognizable. But the lessons he'd learned there, about resilience and adaptation, about the thin margin between survival and death, about the extraordinary lengths humans will go to in order to stay alive, those would stay with him forever. The seal blubber lamp that Frank had fashioned in desperation now resided in a climate-controlled display case at the Alaska Native Heritage Center, positioned next to traditional kulik lamps that showed both the similarities and differences between his improvised solution and the refined technology developed over millennia. Visitors read his story, saw photographs of the ice cave rescue, and learned about the seal blubber lamp technique that had sustained Arctic peoples through the harshest winters imaginable. For Frank, seeing his lamp displayed there felt appropriate, a tangible reminder that sometimes survival requires reaching back to ancient knowledge, that the old ways persist because they work, and that human ingenuity is at its best when it learns from those who came before. He gave occasional talks at the Heritage Center, sharing his story not as a tale of individual heroism, but as an example of how traditional knowledge remains vital and relevant even in the modern age. The 28 days he'd spent in that ice cave had changed him fundamentally, stripping away assumptions and leaving behind a deeper understanding of both human fragility and human strength. He returned to his research, but approached it differently now, always conscious of the power of the environment he studied, always respectful of the indigenous peoples who'd mastered survival in conditions that would kill most modern humans within hours. The seal blubber lamp had saved his life, but it had also taught him lessons about humility, adaptation, and the enduring value of wisdom passed down through generations. Standing at the glacier's edge with the wind howling around him, Frank felt gratitude so profound it bordered on spiritual, grateful for life, for love, for the rescue that had seemed impossible, and for the ancient knowledge that had kept a tiny flame burning in the darkness when all hope seemed lost.